Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Thanks for being with me on this Monday morning. We'll get started here in just a moment. All right, my clock reads 12 o'clock noon on the East Coast, and that's when we're scheduled to be here. Looks like we have a bunch of folks online already, so that's great. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Paul, what is the deal with that chia beard? That looks like it's been fed well and grew out overnight. It is not a chia beard. It's just, I don't have the right clippers right now, so that's what's going on. A little bit too much information about me. Once again, I'm happy that all of you are here. My name is Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services. We focus on test automation. That's what we do, nothing else. Functional test automation. We do consulting, training, and have dedicated experts to help you with that. So we do this. You know what? My microphone looks like it's wrong. I'm gonna switch. Hopefully, you get a better experience here. We focus on test automation. I mentioned we do that in several different ways. So if you want to plan out your test automation strategy, your tactics, make sure that you are set up to be successful with test automation, we can help you with that. If you need training in methodologies or specific skills, whether it's a programming language, whether it's a specific framework, if it's Selenium or something else like that, Cucumber, whatever else, if it's a methodology like ATDD or BDD, we do all that. In fact, we've got a wonderful new training course that's come out on behavior-driven development. We've just done this recently with a major client up in the Midwest, and it's gone off really well. We're looking to do more business with that client on this particular training courses. They have a bunch of people who want to come up to speed with BDD. So if your group is interested in learning behavior-driven development or anything else, give us a yell. A list of those training courses are on the web, beaufortfairmont.com. But that's not what you're here for. You're here for identifying test gaps, and we're going to get to that. You see my Twitter handle here, @Paul_Merrill. Make sure to tweet out to me if you want to tweet things during this conversation. I'd love for you to do that. A couple points as we're going through this, you'll notice that you have a control panel, GoToWebinar control panel. And in there, what you'll see is that there are a couple sections. There's one specifically for questions. And I'm perfectly fine if you guys want to type questions in there as we're going. I'll try to take a couple when we have a break and near the end. Happy to answer questions as we go along if I can. Sometimes it's a little challenging to switch back and forth from that here. You'll also notice that in your control panel, you have the ability to raise your hand. So you can toggle raising your hand or not raising your hand. And if you'd rather just speak into the microphone, I can take you off of mute when I see your hand raised, and you can ask a question in front of the other 100 and some odd many people on the call. So you're welcome to do that as well. Once again, Paul Merrill from Beaufort Fairmont, and I'm happy to be here. If you have any questions or anything else as we go along, let me know. Some of you are on the inside. Some of you know that I try to do the B list every single month when we do these great webinars. And the B list is the Beaufort Fairmont list. It's a way to say thank you to some people, to bring them a little closer on the inner circle here. And these are a few of the folks that I want to thank this month. Sometimes it's a big list. Sometimes it's not so big. It's just a matter of the people that were so gracious to us and helpful to us at Beaufort Fairmont during this time. We had the opportunity. I also want to say a thank you to the Automation Guild. We were part of the Automation Guild this past week. It was wonderful. If you don't know about the Automation Guild, go out to automationguild.com and find out about that virtual conference. It's still available to you. You can still go see all of the recordings, and there was just some wonderful stuff out there. I learned a lot. I think you could as well. So make sure to take a look at that. And we were really thrilled to give away this morning a free Amazon Kindle HD Fire tablet. So that was really cool. Really happy we could do that to our contest winner. So thanks for that opportunity that we had to support the community in that way. A few things upcoming next week. I'll be in Columbus, Ohio. I hope it's not as cold as I think it is. And that will be QA or the Highway. I've heard a lot about this conference over the years. A lot of times it runs about the same time as one that I do here in the Research Triangle called TISCA. But this year is a year when we're not doing TISCA. We do that every other year. So I get to go to Columbus and see my friends up there. So I'm looking forward to seeing old friends, to meeting new ones, to making some new relationships. Anybody who wants to chat, I love to chat. I am approachable. I like to talk to people and get to know people. If you have questions about test automation, if you want to talk through what you're doing with test automation, please come see us there. We will have a booth. I'll be doing a talk on machine learning and testing at QA or the Highway next week. So if you're in the area near Columbus, make sure to go. This looks like it's going to be a wonderful event. I'll be at the TriTalk meetup in a few weeks as well, March the 6th, and I'll be talking there about, I forget, I think it's about test gap analysis again. So the same talk I'll be doing there, except it'll be live. Also in March, we are so lucky. I'm so thrilled to have made this acquaintance, but Andy Knight is also known as the Automation Panda. If you've gone out to automationpanda.com, I believe it is, maybe it's automationpanda.org, just Google Andy Knight and Automation Panda. He does a lot of wonderful stuff with BDD, behavior-driven development, and Gherkin. He is his pages come up at the top of Google because he's such a good source for this type of information. We're going to have him on in March for a webinar. I don't have the date of that nailed down yet. You'll all get notified if you're on our list. If you're not, let me know, and we'll be happy to get you on there. But Andy's going to do a wonderful job with that. I look forward to it. Also, you may or may not know, we do a $50 Amazon card giveaway during this webinar. All you have to do, pay attention, hang out until the end of the call, find out if you won. That's it. It's easy. So let's get into this. This talk is a little bit different. I've done this a little bit different than some of the other ones I've done in the past. It's very image-based, and there's only 10 slides. So you may notice that I get stuck on a slide for several minutes, and that's okay. You're welcome to write in with questions or in the chat and say, hey, Paul, are you stuck? But I'm probably not. There are only 10 slides here because I want us to talk about content instead of the slides. There's not a bunch of bullet points or anything like that. So I'm going to try something new, try something different. There's a couple things that I'd like to do. I would like to have an idea of what all you think about test gaps. So if you have thoughts about test gaps, if you have a preconceived notion of what we're going to talk about here, I'd love to hear it. If you have thoughts or questions about what we're going to talk about, type them into the question box and we'll get started with that. But once again, I'm Paul Merrill, and we're going to talk about test gap analysis today, tools and methods. I was asked to do this talk by a company over in Israel called Sea Lights. And Sea Lights has a very compelling product offering related to code coverage. They wanted me to talk about test gap analysis as it related to that. So I developed this talk, and I'm still developing it. So I'd love your feedback as we go along. Let me know what your thoughts are on this and what I've missed, what I can do better. I want to improve with this talk as well as anything else. But I felt like the first place to start was with the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to solve with test gap analysis? And I thought of how big the problem is and where to start with it. And as I kind of put the concepts onto paper and started getting into this, I realized that it comes down to one thing. The only time that we're really asked to do this is when something's gone wrong, when something's gone really bad wrong. And someone asks, why didn't we catch that in QA? Maybe you've never had that experience. Maybe you have. I think most of you probably have because we're testing professionals here and we've all heard this. Why didn't we catch this? And that kind of presupposes the idea that we could catch whatever defect was released. And it almost has this foundational question that is, did we test everything? Maybe you guys have been asked that directly. How many of you, I wonder how many of you have been asked that directly. Why didn't we catch, why did we test everything? Did we test everything? Now, if you're in a company where software is the core business for your company, that question might be less likely to be asked, because the education across the company and at the top levels of the company is such that we understand we can't possibly test everything. Even with the simplest of applications or services, it would be very difficult to test everything. But I suspect that many of you work in organizations that are not software organizations. The core of their business is something other than that. Maybe they sell shoes. And if you have a CEO in a company that sells shoes, whose core competency is software, I would be surprised. I would think that that executive would probably have a background in retail or in sales or something else. So the education of executives who ask these questions related to testing may not be as high as yours and mine. So I think part of the problem here is that there is an assumption by some people somewhere that are responsible for the business that when something escapes into production, we should have caught it. We should have been able to catch it. It is a problem that is discrete that we can handle, when really we can't test everything. You and I know that. So that also brings us to other ideas. How do we solve this problem? How do we solve the problem of not catching things? Well, maybe number one, we could go back and deal with the source of the problem, that we can't catch everything, and we can educate managers about this. Well, the amount of time that it would take to educate people about this and their willingness to do so is usually not a good match. And for you and I, if you've ever tried to explain something like this to an executive who has other things on their mind and a million other things they should be focusing on, it's not something that's going to happen. You and I as testers are not going to be explaining this to executives. It's just probably not going to happen in a decent, in anything other than a very small business. So this idea that we should have caught it, we should have known, we should have been able to test everything, these aren't really things that we can do. And the problem is much bigger than that, and the problem is getting much bigger all the time at a faster rate. And it's because of several things. Number one, software is no longer a new industry. It's no longer a new practice. It's been around for 60 years. In the last 50 years, it's been out in the public domain. It's been out in the business world and seeping into the business world. In the last 20 years, it's become something that we all use. It's become something that everyone uses as a commodity, and we understand. In the last 10 years, companies have really started keying in on their digital assets and learning how to use that as leverage within their markets. So over this 60 years, a lot of things have happened. One is that we have this ongoing idea of mergers and acquisitions. These happen all the time. I'm sure many of you have experienced them within your own business. Companies are acquired, companies are bought and sold, they're split off, they're spun off into other groups. Lots of different things in terms of mergers and acquisitions happen. And when those happen, a lot of technical people like us naturally say, we should take all the systems that are out there that we just acquired, and we should rewrite them to be a part of our software ecosystem, right? A lot of people say that. I've heard people say it again and again. It's a suggestion that makes a lot of sense on the surface, because on the surface, it sounds like something that makes sense. It sounds like we would have a bunch of value come out of that. The problem is that that's really hard to sell. So you want me to rewrite all of my systems, pay for you developers to go in and rewrite all of our systems. And what am I going to get out of it that's new? How am I going to compete differently in the marketplace? What's going to be different? What market edge do I have to this? How will my customers benefit? How will I be more satisfied? Those are the questions you're going to get. And the answer is you will have paid a lot of stuff for a new product that probably doesn't do all the things the old product does, because we've lost all the requirements and we have no idea over time what the product has been built to do. So this idea that we could rewrite these systems and everything would work coherently, nicely together in the same sets of technologies, it doesn't happen. It's not something we can sell in most cases. It happens from time to time with pieces of technology. So one thing we've had over the last 50 years is mergers and acquisitions. The second thing that we've had, and all the technical complexity inherent in those mergers and acquisitions, systems cobbled on systems, adapters placed in between systems, all of that. The next thing that we've had is we've had technologies change, right? So how many of you are using an Angular built website right now, but a few years ago you were using something completely different? How many have already moved on to React or something even newer than that within their front end for a dynamic, highly responsive experience within your web UI? How many people are on REST UIs right now that were on SOAP a few years ago and something different before that, web services, right? These things change all the time. The technology changes. So we end up with systems that are cobbled together by the latest and greatest technologies of the time, but they're from different times. And the people who wrote those and the people who thought about those and created those did it with that stack in mind. They did it with that type of thinking. They did it with that type of background, that type of architecture. So we have all of these different paradigms and lens that people are looking through coming to us in the form of source code that acts as applications. And then we're cobbling those together. So now we have mergers and acquisitions and new technologies. And finally, lately, we have something even better. One of the greatest things that we can leverage within software, the API economy. What this is APIs all over the place. You probably use them within your systems. If you do payments, most of you do not have your own payment system. You call into some third-party API to handle payments. If you do some type of mapping within your application, you're probably not doing mapping. You're probably calling into some mapping service to get maps to show up on your web UI. There are lots of things like this that we use all the time. Customer information, marketing lists, information about demographics, statistics, information about budgets from the government, and all kinds of different things are available through publicly exposed APIs. So now we have systems that have been cobbled together over many years from different companies using different technologies, and now we have technology used in our own applications coming from third parties that we can't control. So the problem is bigger than it ever has been before, and it's getting bigger and bigger. Identifying test gaps is more difficult than it's ever been before. So I was thinking through this and realizing that really test gap analysis, all that is testing. That's what we do as testers, right? What we do as testers is we want to mitigate risk. We're not interested in eliminating risk because we can't do that. We can mitigate risk. And really what we'd like to do if we're going to be very effective is we would like to isolate particular risks and mitigate the most important ones as our stakeholders communicate to us. We'd like to be effective about things and efficient with them. We as testers are trying to interact with our systems under test to gain information and to take that information that's accurate and deliver it to people who make decisions in a clear, concise way. That's our job. We want to take information that we've learned about the system and give it back to stakeholders, people who are making decisions based on it. That's exactly what test gap analysis is. Testing is test gap analysis. That's the whole job. So really, what we're trying to do with test gap analysis is we're trying to look at what we test today as mapped against some model of the system we're testing, and what we don't test today as mapped against the same model. And then we're trying to identify what that gap is accurately. There are a few problems with that. It presupposes that we understand exactly the full collection of all features, of all requirements. Do we ever have that? There are 138 people connected to this call right now. I'm happy to have every single one of you, but if one of you has that for every feature in every testable way for your application, I would love to hear about it. Because I've never been to a place where they do, and I talk to many different companies every single week about this kind of stuff. The idea is we want to take the collection of all features, we want to map what it is we tested against them, and then we want to make sure that we know what hasn't been tested. And all we're trying to do there is mitigate risk. So I was thinking about this and realizing that really what we're trying to do is very similar to the law of process from John Maxwell's 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. It's a wonderful book. I've done a number of different trainings on this. It isn't something that we offer from Beaufort Fairmont usually, unless somebody just asks me for it. But I love doing leadership training. It's a wonderful thing, and one of the things that can level up your people very, very quickly. And this is a great book to do that based on. But he talks about the law of process. And the idea is that whenever we start out with something, we generally don't know what we don't know, right? So there's this piece of information that we may not even be aware of. We aren't aware of in any way, shape, or form. We've got a good model for what we're working on. We've got a certain amount of information we're working and making decisions based off of, but we don't know what we don't know. This is what happens when a defect escapes into production most of the time. We didn't know we were supposed to test it. We didn't know that functionality actually existed. If we had, we would have done things differently. So we didn't know what we didn't know. So a defect escapes. That's usually how we know that there's some gap, right? And then we realize, oh, we need to know something. Why did that escape? Where did that defect come from? We need to know something. Number 3, we get to this point where we say, we know what we don't know. That defect is something related to our LDAP system and authorization and credentials or whatever within our system. So we know what we don't know. We become aware of what this defect is, what it means, how it relates to the business, how it relates to the customer or the client or the business area that it impacts. And finally, we gain enough information about it that we get to a point where we know what we know. So we're aware of what we know. And sometimes we're aware of the things that we don't know. This is testing, moving as many things as possible from this area that we don't know what we don't know into an area where we know what we know. Those are the same as test gaps. There's a certain portion within a gap related to testing that we know about. We know we don't cover this particular gap. And then there's another piece that's like the iceberg underneath the water. We don't know what it is that we don't know. We don't know what we're not testing. So in walking through this, I realized there are several different tools and methodologies for approaching this. And I'm going to go through basically 4 ideas of this. And they are automation, reskilling, test gap analysis, and potentially static code analysis, although that doesn't sound right at the moment. It's in my notes, but it doesn't sound right. Forgive me here. Also, bonus points if you know what machine this image goes to. If you know what that is, let us know in the chat or in the questions there. But tools and methods. So we could go through and we could find ways to approach this. We talked a little bit about the idea of test gap analysis. That was really formal way of doing this, and I'm going to get into it again in just a minute. But that would be one method for doing this. We can implement certain methodologies to help out with this, that type of stuff. And I see certain people are getting those bonus points. They know the answer here. I wonder if there is a correlation with age. No offense to anyone, but I bet that there is a correlation with age. Anyway, and I'll tell you what it is. You've all gotten it right so far that I've typed in, but you're doing great there. So, and I'll give you that image one more time just in case you want to take a little closer look. Apparently that was neat. So, okay, so test gap analysis. So what is that method for finding test gaps? Generally, we talked about it. Generally, what you're doing is you're looking back at requirements or stories. You're mapping each of those requirements to a set of test cases, and each of those test cases to code somehow, some way. Usually you don't even get to that point. You've just got some other model of what the actual application is. I guess in this case, it's the requirements. We try to think through, does every requirement have at least one test case or more, right? Does it have more than one test case? And then we may even look through the area between requirements, right? So we've got a requirement that every user should have a password. We've got a requirement that, good luck finding this on the fly here, Paul, with this example. We've got one that talks about user password combinations that we have to have a user and a password. We've got one that shows that we should always have a name. So what's in between there? Well, what about when we have a user and a password, but we don't have a name in the system yet, right? So there are these gaps between requirements that we want to identify. And that's what we're doing with this application. So it usually takes, I said application, I meant process. It usually takes a lot of labor. It usually takes a lot of people. It presupposes that somehow you can know the full set of features. It usually happens after an application has been in production, which means that your paperwork, your requirements, your user stories are old. Many times, any versions of those that are still around after something's gone to production, they're not usually living documents. They're usually things that go stale very, very quickly, which means we have a model that is stale. So we have to update the model, those types of things. You also have to know what you test, what you actually test. How many companies know what they test? How many members of teams here actually know what they test within their application? I see lots of tools out there, whether it's Jira or one of the Visual Studio team systems or team services. I don't remember. I think it's called Azure DevOps now. Many systems out there for connecting these up, for mapping requirements or user stories over to tests. BDD is about that, right? And I mentioned we're doing a wonderful training course right now on BDD. I hope you look into that before the day is over. But you have to know what you actually test. Then you have to know what you want to test, right? So how do you identify the gaps that you find and whether or not they're important? This is all a part of this. Eliminating test gaps. That's a fool's errand. We can't go in and eliminate all the test gaps. We want to make conscious decisions about which gaps we allow. We want to make conscious decisions about which test gaps we allow. That's what we're trying to do here. So test gap analysis would require a bunch of people, bunch of time, bunch of paper. Test gap analysis. One of the major things you can do for finding test gaps is to reskill or upskill your individuals. I've said this before and I'll say it again. The most important and most valuable piece of any organization in software today is gray matter. It's the matter between here and here. It's what's in your head, what's in your people's minds. We can reskill our testers. I can't tell you the number of times that I have asked, and I've mentioned this a lot of times too, that I've asked a tester, what is it you do? And they can't tell me. What is it that makes you as a tester different from anybody else? What are your skills? What skills have you learned? What books have you read today? What blogs do you read often? Who do you follow on Twitter related to testing? These types of things. How do you learn about testing? What's your formal approach to testing? What method do you use in your testing? And I get blank stares. What approach does your team use to testing? Do you have a method? Does everybody just test whatever they want? How does that work? How do you decide what to test? How do you decide who tests what? Reskill your people. Upgrade your gray matter. Force it if you have to. Some folks will opt into this. Some folks will self-select. These are the people that go to meetups. I see them there all the time. These are the people who read on their own. These are the people who find subject matter that they want to explore. These are the people who have a passion for testing, want to get better at it, and want to improve. A lot of other people need a structured, well-defined, and highly incentivized training course or training courses. And we do this a lot with a number of different things. Exploratory testing. That's one of the best things to learn. So often I sit down and I'll do exploratory testing with someone when I'm out doing a consultation, just to kind of understand where a lot of different things, but one of them is where are we coming from with testing? How do we test? How do we approach tests? So we may do a 20-minute exploratory testing session, me and one other person from the client company. And we'll sit down and I'll let them create the charter and figure out exactly what it is we're going to do with our exploratory testing, what area of the application we're going to focus on. And the ability of folks to explore an application in a way that is helpful, at a depth that is helpful, to learn a set of features quickly. That's a skill. That's something that comes over time. It's something that can be taught. It's something that can be improved upon. Great book out there by Elizabeth Hendrickson called Explore It, on exploratory testing. I learned a lot from that book. It's an easy read. She's a wonderful writer. It's available on Kindle and lots of other platforms as well. You can also find her as Test Obsessed on Twitter. But Elizabeth Hendrickson, that was one of the best books that I've read on testing. It was terrific. You could reskill toward automation. A lot of companies think, hey, we've got to reskill our testers as automation testers, as test automation engineers, as software development engineers. That's one way to go. I've written about this. Go out to Tech Beacon and look at my articles there on this subject, techbeacon.com. Automation, teaching automation is a special thing. There are certain people who want to do it, certain people who don't want to do it. I think a lot of testers are being pushed towards automation who have already opted out. They already had the chance to learn to program. They didn't want to do it then. They don't want to do it now. Maybe it doesn't click with their brain. Maybe it's something that's not interesting. Maybe they don't want to think that way or do things that way or learn that. That doesn't mean they don't have value. There are a lot of testers out there who have really strong value. And the truth is, true testing can't be automated anyway. We need these people. We need these people, regardless of whether they automate or not. The methods. You can go back and reskill in methods. I talked about, I'm not going to pound you on this, but BDD, the course that we've got coming out, you could train about ATDD. You could go learn about rapid software testing from Michael Bolton and his group of peers that teach that methodology. You can learn about agile testing from Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory. You could go out and learn about the METS methodology, the minimal essential testing system from Greg Pascal. There are lots and lots of methods that you can learn about within your company to raise the skills of the testers. And when we raise those skills, we start eliminating gaps because we're better at testing. We can find more of the application. We can cover more of the application with our behaviors as testers. Heuristics, learn about heuristics. What are the little things that I can know to test in any application? Anytime I come up with this, what is it that I'm going to know? How is that going to work? Heuristics are really helpful to learn as well. So reskilling testers, reskilling your organization for a methodology, a skill, whatever it is, can be incredibly helpful in narrowing the gap in testing. Automate. This is it. This is all your problems go away with test automation. This is it, right? I've said it before. You sprinkle the magic fairy dust of test automation on it. All the problems go away. It's easy. That's not true. That's all sarcasm. Problems do not go away with automation. Automation is not easy. Good automation is not easy. You need to know what you're doing to not make the mistakes that cost so many companies so dearly. And of course, we can help you with that when you're ready. It's not magic fairy dust. It doesn't just go away. Automation doesn't do anything related to test gap analysis. It doesn't get rid of the test gaps. It doesn't mitigate risk. It doesn't do any of that. The things that get rid of the test gap, the things that mitigate risk are the human beings that are involved. Automation is one way that we can reach out across a greater and faster growing surface area of what needs to be tested and get more of it into a situation where we know what changed, we know what's new. That's a very, very valuable thing to learn in discovering what the problems are with this. It's not magic fairy dust as much as I would like it to be and as much as my customers would like it to be. Automation is really helpful in a lot of ways. It can make it so that what we do is highly repeatable in a uniform way and that the reporting we get from it is mechanized and persisted and archived. And we can look back at the history of it to see what's changed over time, to see which features used to work and which ones don't. There's a lot that we can do with automation, but automation itself does not get rid of test gaps. It can help you in the sense that when you start automating, many times companies will put more thought into what they automate and more thought into what they test, thereby identifying the test gap and identifying which part of the gap to go after. But in and of itself, test automation does not do that. And you all know that because you're on these webinars all the time and you've heard me talk about it before. Code coverage. Code coverage. So code coverage is a wonderful tool for some companies. It's one of the ones that we like to use as a baseline tool with many of our customers. If you're not familiar with code coverage, the idea is that code coverage tells you which parts of the application have been exercised and which parts have not. It tells us that at the source code level. So when you're looking at this slide here and you see that, and by the way, bonus points again, and by those of you who got the bonus points before, it was a typewriter. You were right. Okay, good work. It was a typewriter, and some of you actually had the name of the typewriter in there, the actual brand, which was really cool. I imagine if you spent a lot of time on typewriters and you looked at enough of those brands enough, that might be something you would just kind of know over time, but that's pretty cool. So good work on that. Now, if you know the language that this is written in, there's bonus points for that too, right? I don't know what bonus points mean, but at least, you know, if you're competitive, hey, you're getting something, right? I guess it was 100 for the last one. It's 101 for this one. I don't know. So tell me what language you think this is in. That would be cool. So the idea of code coverage, if you were to take this slide, and if instead of the if else in the embedded part here, you see where it says if right near the middle of the screen, if clients dot has open paren a square bracket 1 closing square bracket closing paren, that's called a conditional. If that if were there, and you also see an else about 3 lines later, if that else was not an else but an if, we could write a test case that would go through and cover all of those lines of code, 7, 8, 9 lines of code inside that outer if. It would go in and exercise those lines. Code coverage tells us what's exercised within the code. It does not tell us what was tested within the code. This is a major difference and a major distinction. And I want you to take note of it because it's very important. As a tester, you're sitting in these conversations with developers, our developer colleagues and friends. And our developers will say, oh, we've got 100% code coverage on that, so no need to test it. Anytime anybody says, no need to test it, I go, what? What's going on? I don't know what that was. I don't know where that voice came from, but it was fun, right? Anytime I hear that, I get nervous, okay? 100% code coverage does not mean everything's been tested, especially with unit tests. I'll say that again, especially with unit tests. Unit tests could go in and test this one if and the one else, and it could test them separately, right? We could see with code coverage which one was tested, but in the case where instead of that else in the middle, we had an if, we could write a test case that went through and covered and exercised all of those lines in the outer if, and you would get 100% code coverage for that section of code, right? That block of code, 100%. Are we done? Well, no. If it was 2 different ifs, you could also write a test case that went in and exercised the top if and not the bottom if. So that's 2 situations, right? One where we go into both ifs, one where we go into one and not the other. There's a third case where we don't go into the top piece of code and we actually exercise the second piece. That's 3. And finally, if you don't exercise both of those 2 blocks, is a 4th case. So there are 4 different ways to exercise the code just inside that outer if. 4 different ways. You need at least 4 different test cases to go in and try it 4 different ways, right? But once again, that's only what's been exercised. If you don't assert that something's correct, that something's changed, if you don't verify that something's changed within those lines of code, you're not testing anything. Some people would say you're not testing anything anyway. I say you do. Anyway, you're not making sure that things are correct in those areas if you do that. So it would be easy to write a few different unit tests or one unit test that goes in and gets 100% code coverage for this block of code, but doesn't actually test anything, right? So code coverage in and of itself does nothing for test gap analysis. What I like with code coverage and the way that we use it is it's a wonderful baseline metric. It's a wonderful foundational metric to work with. Most of the clients we work with are new to test automation or new to a leveled up type of automation. And what I find with them is that many of them don't use code coverage for their test automation. In fact, when I ask, tell me about your automation platform, they can always tell me we have 3,000 or 10,000 tests written in Selenium, right? That we've always got those numbers ready to go. And those are helpful numbers. Those are important numbers. But if we don't have some measure of what we're testing, it's not really helpful. So if we can add one measure where we had none, we can potentially move in a certain direction and get some momentum off of that and get some help off of it. When we add code coverage and we at least see what's exercised, we can go back and ask the question, yes, is it exercised, but is it tested? Now we can start creating good tests that go along with it, that actually test functionality that matters to us. With code coverage, we can actually see which lines of code have been exercised and which ones have not, which means that at minimum, we can identify the piece that's not and write tests to cover that and exercise that. We still have to ask the question, what are we testing? Are we testing what we mean to test? So code coverage can be a wonderful baseline metric. It can identify gaps in your testing if you're using automation. It can help you narrow those gaps as well. Many, many great tools out there for it. Most programming languages or IDEs, integrated development environments, come with something in them. I really love the tools from JetBrains. JetBrains makes some great tools for both Java and C#, two of the major languages that we work in, and probably a bunch of you as well. I believe they also have tools for other languages, but I'm not going to say they do because I just don't know off the top of my head. They have tools that will plug in not only to your IDE, but also into your pipeline, your deployment pipeline. So you've got your test running automatically in a deployment pipeline. You get code coverage from that. You can see what's going on. You can actually add triggers. So let's say code coverage drops below 80%, whatever it is. We can have a trigger that says, no, build failed. Somebody's got to go back and increase the code coverage before we let it go on any farther. That's pretty nice, right? Any of these activities that we can take out of that, that part of the brain that does all the heavy lifting and put it into the part that doesn't, right? Anything that we can do like that, where it's just a go-to type automatic response that informs us, that we can go back and use to do more comprehensive thinking about what we're testing, is really helpful. Let's use those tools to get clear signals about what's going on in our applications as they're developed, as they go along. We love code coverage as a baseline metric. Cost versus benefits. We talked about several different things. We talked about reskilling. We talked about code coverage. We talked about automation. We talked about doing a formal test gap analysis. With a formal test gap analysis, we said, hey, big cost in terms of labor. Lots of times we forget about that as employees of companies, but labor is a cost. Big cost in terms of labor, big cost in terms of conversations and distractions, who you're going to bother, big cost in terms of timeliness. It's not going to be real time. It's going to be very hard to make a test gap analysis that's done by hand real time. You can do this with applications. So you may have Jira plus X-Ray or something along those lines to get your traceability. Once you have traceability from requirement down to test case, now you can start compiling what's covered and what's not. If you have those inside applications like Jira or some other tool, that can be very helpful for this. That's more up to date and more real time. When you get into automation and you have test cases that are written in automation and running all the time, you've got a better chance of things being real time because they're going to run all the time. They're going to be up to date with the code if you're doing it right. So we can see what's actually getting tested and what's not. We can map that back against the very same tools many times that I mentioned earlier, the Jiras, the VSTS, those types of tools. Code coverage is also a helpful metric, and I meant to mention C-Lights as another group that does code coverage as well, and I appreciate their help on this, getting me started on this webinar a few weeks ago and doing it on their site. Many different ways to approach this. You got to remember several things, though. That number one, we don't know what all has to be tested, and I believe there's a high correlation between saying that we know what needs to be tested and danger. So I think the more we think we know what needs to be tested, the more we think we really know about an application, the more dangerous we get. So I think leaving the door cracked, leave that door cracked in terms of what we can learn about applications, even if you've been doing it with the same application for many years. There's always something new. There's always a new way to learn about it, and more that we can find out there. That's when we get to be really good testers. You can reskill, you can help your people ramp up. Formal education in terms of training courses and things like that are very, very helpful. So it looks like a bunch of you think that this is JavaScript. I have to tell you, I don't actually know the answer. I asked you a question without knowing the answer. That's like the cardinal sin of asking questions. Always know the answer before you ask the question, they say. It is not Java, and I know that for a fact out of looking at it. It's not C#, I know that as well. But some of you said Node. Node runs on JavaScript. Some of you, I think, may have said TypeScript, and I'm not sure about that, Brian. I see you there, Brian. But you guys tell me. Go look it up. See if it'll work. I'll be happy to share these slides afterwards. There's always a recording of these for that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say thank you for right now and start typing in questions. Anything that you've asked up to this point, I'm going to try to just ignore, because they were all just answers to the 2 bonus points questions from before. But what questions do you have about test gap analysis? What did you want to cover out of this that we didn't cover? What are some of your thoughts on it? Do you do this? Do you do test gap analysis in your groups? How do you approach it? Do you approach it like this, or is there something different? And once again, if you raise your hand in here, I will try to notice you and recognize you and take you off of mute here. But yeah, let's hear your thoughts and questions. What types of thoughts does this evoke in your mind? It takes a little bit of time to type these questions into the question section, which is why I'm stalling. And we can do this at the same time while we're waiting for some questions. I'll go ahead and do, well, I want to wait for questions before I do that. I don't see any. Maybe I'm not asking the right question. How are you feeling about this? How does your organization approach this? Let me know. Oh, here we go. Now we got some coming in. It just takes a little while. Oh, so this one's from Tina. Tina says, we do not do test gap analysis, and QA is seen as a backdrop. Tina, I'd love to know what that means, a backdrop. I'm guessing that it means that you're thought of as kind of secondary or as ancillary to the real work going on. She's saying yes, so that sounds like I hit that one on the head. She says, how do we get managers to buy in? And I'm thinking what you're saying is, how do we get managers to buy in to the activity of test gap analysis? Well, their job is is founded on it. Like, what's going to happen to your vice president of software development when a bug comes out that takes away half the revenue of your company, if revenue is important to your company? Well, they're going to get canned. They're going to get kicked out. Go find another job. You were responsible for that. So the buy-in should not be hard. How do we, if right now, the trouble, Tina, the trouble that I would see as a tester and as a test organization would be going to a higher level manager and saying, we don't actually know what we test right now. That's not a good look, right? Not a very good look. So you probably got to be a little more clever about how you approach it with them. It's not that you need to do it, and I'm not necessarily saying that you need to do a test gap analysis, but knowing what you test, knowing what you want to test, and being directed and clear about what you're testing is absolutely key. Being able to account for what you test and be conscious about the decisions you make is key. That is a major part of our job. So I'm going to answer a couple other questions on here, at least have a conversation about them. Let's see. I appreciate all of these. This is great. What are good tools for integration test gaps? So I'm guessing what you mean by that, Teresa, is the gaps created by integrations of systems. So what are good tools for finding those gaps? And number one, I would say a good integration test, right? That's the first thing. So a suite of integration tests. This is an area that I see missed a whole lot with testers in general, is I think as testers, we tend to see one whole complete application. We don't necessarily see it as a broken up set of systems or subsystems. And our friends in development definitely see it that way. So if you can get them to draw up diagrams, very simple diagrams, it's hard to get highly technical people to do anything simple, but if you could just draw me some boxes, right? Just draw some basic boxes. We have this system here, arrows to this system here, arrows to this system there. Then we got to think about how do we test where those arrows are, right? So a good developer in your organization can help you identify those. Integration tests are something that I love. I absolutely think is crucial to organizations, especially the automated ones, because we want to know, are the connections between systems and subsystems what they should be? Are they working? So this is in our pyramid in Mike Cohn's automation pyramid. This is that middle tier, the service level tests. These are the ways that systems work together, those service level ones. Thank you so much for the question. Let me know if you have more to that question. I'm going to answer a couple more of these before we do this drawing. Eli says, how do you do test gap analysis when you have severely incomplete requirements? Right. So Eli, I want to pick on you for just a minute. I won't pick on you. I'll say this a different way. So what I see a lot of times is I see it being very easy to blame things on incomplete requirements. I see it being very easy to do that. To complain about something else, that's easy. Complaining is easy. I see people all the time. Since I run this business as a small business, people say things to me about their business ideas. They talk to me about their business ideas. I love doing that and talking about them with people. But I hear a lot of people say things like, "Oh man, I had that idea, but somebody else did it," right? Well, that's easy. It's easy to make comments about something as an armchair quarterback. The requirements aren't there. That's easy. What's hard is filling the gaps, actually going in and figuring out what requirements are missing and how we're supposed to do it. And I bet if you're a good tester in your neck of the woods with your particular feature set, however you scope out what you do, I bet you know a lot more of the requirements than was ever written up. In just about all of your cases, I bet you know them. So you could write them down just as easily as anybody else. And I'm picking on you a little bit, Eli. But how do I go about it? Well, for me, what I try to do in a lot of situations is figure out what can I actually do about it? What is within the realm of possibilities for me to do something? How can I do something to move this forward rather than they didn't do this, they didn't do that? How do I do something? And that's not always possible. The larger the organization, the harder that seems to get. But what can I do to move this forward? So can you fill in some of the requirements? Can you complete them? Another way to do it, we talked about a couple others, right? If you have no requirements and you use code coverage, you can start to see which pieces of the code are not there. If you have a set of requirements that you can start from, that may be a good baseline, but all requirements are incomplete. So just keep that in mind. How do you measure coverage in microservices architecture with a bunch of Selenium tests on the front end using their API? Well, I don't know, and this is from Wilson. I appreciate the question. I don't know that I would. Well, so you can get code coverage metrics from a piece of code that's running, provided it's set up to give you code coverage. In the case that you're talking about, you're going to have to do a couple things. You're going to have to isolate as much of the microservice that you want to know about as you can from other users. Most of the time in a situation like this, it's difficult to set up the whole system, and so you only have one or two pre-prod systems. And the trouble with getting code coverage results is that you don't have code coverage that's isolated to your test cases. Instead, what you have is code that's being exercised by a lot of different clients. I think that's probably where you're getting to there. But getting code coverage for a particular piece of code is generally not that big of a deal. Selenium being the thing to drive the test cases, to drive the behaviors, that's not, it doesn't really matter from the code coverage point of view what it is that's driving it. The question I think is a lot bigger than I could answer here, Wilson, but I'm happy to talk to you offline. We just got a couple more minutes. There are a bunch of questions here. I'll try to get back to these as much as I can after this. Sometimes I'm not able to, but I'll try. You're welcome to email me, paul@beaufortfairmont.com. It's right there on your screen right now. Welcome to reach out to me on Twitter, DM me there. But I want to know, using Penny H's MP3 for the drum roll. Thank you, Penny H. I saw she was on the call. Who is going to win today? And it is going to be, oh, I forget that. I had the name all picked out. It is Joel C. Joel C., you have won the Amazon gift card today. And that usually comes around 24 to 48 business hour, 1 to 2 business days after this. I'll send it out. Look, give me a call. I like talking about test automation. I love talking to people on their challenges. Let's set up a time to talk through this. I do a free hour with just about anybody to talk about test automation. So reach out to me in email, however you want to do it. Let's set up some time to go through that together and figure out what's going on with your test automation. A lot of times we can come to some type of solution, some type of idea that can move you forward in that 1 hour call. Sometimes it's bigger than that. We need to talk about what we need to do outside of that call. I like to learn from you guys as much as you learn from me. I learn on every one of those calls, and I'll do my best to answer your questions based on my experience over the last 20 years in test automation in many different programming languages, many different frameworks, many different architectures, many different systems. We work with lots of clients across the US for test automation. Make sure to reach out when you're ready to bring us in. Thank you all so much for being here today. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too, and I look forward to seeing you soon. If you're going to be at one of these conferences like QA or the Highway, please stop me and let's talk, okay? Thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.